Hi everyone, I'm Jesse Lynn.
And I'm Angela Lynn, and welcome back to another episode of But Where Are You Really From? I'm super excited because I have one of my good friends from business school, Michael, on the show. Hello.
Hello. Yeah, my name's Michael. I met Angela in business school in Chicago. Currently, I live in LA and have been here for the past 2 years, just before the quarantine. Where I'm really from is I grew up in Florida, but my dad is Taiwanese and my mom is Burmese.
Well, you mentioned the quarantine is highly relevant to the conversation that we're going to have today because Jesse and I are hyper curious about what dating was like during the pandemic. In the past, we've definitely talked about dating and relationships on the show before, and in many different facets, but this is one where we were like, well, we can't have a perspective on it ourselves. I think I had many conversations, like casual conversations with friends who kind of mentioned some of the quirkiness of doing it via Zoom, essentially, largely. So wanted to take today to talk about kind of like comparing and contrasting Zoom dating with IRL dating. So, I'd love to hear, I mean, it's so bizarre of a concept to me to begin with, but I'm sure we can get into a whole slew of ways it sucked. But are there any surprisingly positive things that came out of Zoom dating versus IRL date?
This is just you only have to dress up from the top half, which was a little bit nice. But no, I'd say it was an interesting experience because it felt a little bit more loose and casual when you were going in because, after you got used to it and got over a little bit of the weirdness, it was really just kind of more of a conversation, and you realize it's no different than talking on FaceTime or Zoom with your friends. And so, I think that kind of took away some of the pressure in the moment. And it also just kind of felt more like hey, this feels like more of an opportunity just to get to know someone in a pretty, loose setting, not in a bar where it's really loud and you're having to order drinks and think about all the other extraneous stuff, but you're really already in a really comfortable space. Like I was on my couch or, sitting at my dining room table or things like that. And so it kind of took some of the edge off. So that part was a pretty surprising thing. Cause I think, going in quarantine, for me personally, I was never a big FaceTime or Zoom type person. And I think, we all kind of learned how to do that type of virtual interaction really quickly. And so, admittedly, the first time was super weird. Just there was just so many things going on, but just both sides, we just didn't know how to handle it, right? So I think once we realized it was oh, this is awkward for both of us.
Yeah.
This is a weird, situation. Let's just kind of embrace it. It just became a much more kind of normal conversation once we got over that hurdle.
That's awesome. Do you feel you mentioned usually there's a lot of distractions with a lot of other things to kind of factor in. Do you feel like you paid more attention to what the other person is saying because I feel like sometimes when I used to date and I was on first dates and you said in bars and stuff, there's so much to think about of I don't know, for me, I care a lot about what other people think about me. So I'm oh, do I look cute right now? What's good? Oh, is he judging what I ordered for my drink? Things like that versus maybe they're talking to me and telling me something about their life while I'm thinking all these things and not actually listening. Did you feel you were oh, actually this is the most focused I've been on a date, or are you usually a much better listener than I am?
No, I think it definitely made it easier to really hear and listen to the conversation. It definitely made awkward pauses that much more awkward because when you're in a bar setting, you can kind of find things to talk about around the bar, or you have noise around you to kind of fill the air. So I will say, like, kind of in some of the virtual dates that I had, you kind of get to the point where you know whether it's going to be a good conversation or not, like a little bit faster. Because if that dead air is happening in the first 5 minutes, you're kind of both sides are like, oh, this is going to be a little bit of a weird, a weird 30 minutes, and let's see what, it's kind of just getting off on the wrong foot a little bit. So yeah, it was, I will say, obviously it's mixed, right? Some of them were really great conversations, and then other ones, it was just more like, it almost kind of accentuates what was going to go good or bad in the IRL setting when you're doing an activity or at a bar. It kind of gets to that point much faster.
So some foundational questions for my better knowledge and understanding of your situation. When were you officially in lockdown? Because I know people were in different stages at different times.
Yeah, so in LA, we went into lockdown probably mid to late March.
Okay.
And so so it was really like April and May were really like hunker down, like we didn't know what was going on, really avoided going outside and even going shopping, right? It was the toilet paper run and hoard everything. So yeah, exactly. Which, I think it was, so that means it started pretty early for me. So like right off the bat, it just felt like very much like, okay, this is going to be a little bit of a journey.
When did you move to LA again?
I moved in November 2019.
Okay.
So I got maybe 2 or 3 good months in LA before things really locked down and shut down. So, on the one hand, at least I had a little bit of time to get to know the city, but it's definitely been, I still feel quite new, even though I've been here for 2 years.
So how long after lockdown went into effect were you like, I can no longer hold out, I must see another human being or I will go crazy?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm trying to think back because it's been so long, but I'd say like a month in is where I think at least it felt like, okay, we can be outside. And that's when I first would reach out to my close circle of friends and say, let's go on a hike. And I remember when we went on a hike, it's very much like we need to be 6 feet apart still though. Mm-hmm. And it still felt very much like a weird social setting where we weren't quite hanging out together. We were just at least within each other's presence. Yeah. And then, I think kind of around that same time was when it was like, all right, well, maybe, the virtual dating thing is something that, I'll give a try, or, hey, I just wanted to interact with some new people. And that felt like at that point, a month in was like, all right, let's try it out and see what happens.
And just out of curiosity, which app did you go to first? Or did you use an app, or did you find dates on
Yeah. No, definitely the apps. I think it was like mostly Hinge, maybe a little bit of Bumble. Those two mainly. And I remember like back in April, there was so much time. So it's just like, when they're sitting on the couch watching Netflix or something, it's just be swiping and then see what happens.
Cool. Foundation set for me. Perfect. Excellent. I'm wondering during this time, because you do have you have more need to connect with people and you have like tons of options through the apps. Did you find that you were going on dates with people you normally probably would not have?
Yeah, I think that was one of the interesting things, especially during quarantine, but also for me personally being in a new city, right? So it definitely was more like a, hey, maybe not sure whether I would typically, interact or go on a date with this person. But, when it's a FaceTime and, there isn't as much planning involved and the bar is a little bit lower in terms of what you have to prepare and all that, it just made it a little bit more open to talking to maybe, some people that I wouldn't have in the past. Sometimes it was great. sometimes it was definitely like oh nope, that just kind of reaffirms like kind of like my you know, my taste and everything like that. But it was definitely you know, an opportunity to kind of, you know, talk to folks that I didn't, you know, have a chance to really talk to before.
Nice. That's interesting. I was just thinking, like, based off of, because you kind of said like 30 minutes, and then Angela was saying like what people think about you. Did you feel like you were more loose in the Zoom dates because there's less of a like social pressure? It's kind of just like, okay, well, like if I never see them again, that's cool. But if I was in a bar, it could be like weird because there are people watching if it doesn't end up going well.
Yeah, I'd say it was really weird. I mean, obviously, even when I was doing the FaceTime, I would have at least a drink, because it's kind of weird to just sit there talking. And, you know, typically, you know, we would both have like a glass of wine or something like that. And so, you know, I think you're right. As I mentioned before, like when you don't have all this external stuff happening around you, it really did kind of take some of the pressure off, and made it easier to have good conversation if the conversation was there. I think that's where it was kind of like, hey, if there's clearly not a connection, then it would be a bit, you know, it just felt a little bit more awkward in that moment, because you really didn't have anywhere else to go, or, you know, nothing to kind of, you know, distract or try to lead the conversation somewhere else.
That's interesting. So you feel like the Zoom dating was, the way that you're describing it makes me almost think of it kind of like speed dating, whereas like in a real date you might start out like slow and you're like, oh, I don't know if I like this, but because you're like committed to being in that space, it might turn out well, like you give the person more time. But in the Zoom thing, you're kind of just like 5 minutes.
Yeah. I mean, it never felt like there was like a timer on, you know, when I was on a Zoom date, but it definitely was just like, all right, like 5 minutes in, you just get a better sense of like, is there something here, or, you know, is this going to be something where we found something to talk about, right? Because it didn't, otherwise it felt super forced, and then it just gets kind of weird, and then you're in both sides, you can just kind of tell is, all right, how does this end? And then, but I will say, like on the FaceTime thing, it's like you just kind of click the end call button and it's done. So there is that little bit of an advantage to when it was more the Zoom dating or the virtual dating.
Going back to the idea of connection, so my question is about kind of like how you balance things like physical attraction in terms of, one, like you mentioned you went on some dates with people you normally wouldn't have. Does that include people that, like, you know, maybe you had like a certain physical attractiveness type before, and this time you're like, oh, well, now I know conversations were more important, so you're like scanning for the profile for more like, I don't know, quote unquote interesting people, versus someone who just physically looks like your usual type? And then also, how did you gauge physical attraction on the call? Because I feel like even though we talked about there's a lot of downside with like distractions and whatnot in a bar setting or whatever, there is a lot of kind of like body language, and like there's something you can't really like, you know, convey with like words what that thing is, but like you can kind of tell when you're IRL with someone if there is that connection that the screen takes away a little bit of. So how did you like navigate that and balance the kind of importance, I guess, of that element?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, at the beginning it was still kind of staying within the same kind of physical attraction lane that I was used to, and then kind of more like to the latter like point you had, it's more like, oh, this person has an interesting background, or they have an interesting job that I've never really, you know, connected with before, or would have not really seen myself, you know, having a date with. But then, you know, over time, I think, you know, just by having really interesting dates and good experiences, it was like, okay, like maybe expand the horizons even more. But you're right. I think to your second question, you're right. That is something that you miss out on versus in real life. Is it kind of interacting through a screen is very limiting when it comes to like just the overall physical connection, because you kind of miss out on a lot of those cues, or listening to a conversation through a speaker kind of removes some of the intimacy and the connection there. But so that's why it was even more like about the conversation itself, than but even though like usually on a date the physical attraction is like very important, it's just not really as easy to gauge when you're doing it over FaceTime.
So at what point, because you mentioned like, in the beginning we all thought we were going to die, essentially. We all thought there was contagion in real life, right? Like that's what it felt like. So at what point were you like, I feel safe enough to like have an outdoor, like a park date or something with someone and shift this off Zoom? It's like, oh, I've talked to this person enough times on Zoom, I actually want to meet them in real life? Or were you just like, I need humans, and just like started doing first dates even outdoor? Like what point was that for you?
Yeah, I'd say by like the summer, I think after a few, like maybe 2 or 3 Zoom chats, at that point it's like, okay, well, clearly there's, a connection and we enjoy talking to each other. And at that point, things felt less, less scary. And I think for me personally, also, like I had been going and meeting up with friends more often. I think people also just started to hang out with friends more. So it felt like a natural extension to suggest a date with someone. Obviously, like the first few times was very much like, let's go to a park, let's wear our masks, let's go on a walk. And just basically do the FaceTime experience, but a little bit just while walking basically. And so I'd say, yeah, it took a couple months, and then at the point where it was just more like, hey, where I kind of just like was like, no more FaceTime dating, I'd say it was once the vaccines came out, probably like this year is when it was like, okay, like as long as we were both vaccinated, I was more comfortable meeting up at a bar or a restaurant for the first time at that point.
And then related, and I'll relinquish the floor, is so another one of our friends who I will not name told me about a date and whatever. She was just recounting her date, but she mentioned like they kissed. And I was just like so curious about at what point, I think it was like pre-vaccine. So it was kind of like, okay. I was curious at the time of like, how do you gauge when to like trust someone, I guess? Because I mean, someone you've been on a few dates with, still kind of a stranger, right? And in such a weird climate of like, I don't know how and when I might get this thing, and like, but I'm attracted to you and I like need social interaction and like all this stuff. Did you have those moments, or were you like, no, we're not doing this till vaccine comes out?
Yeah, no, I'd say like, in the earlier days, it felt so like, I feel like everybody was like, to meet up in person, like we have to like be on the same page about, social distancing and, being responsible. I mean, I think at that point when you're meeting up with in person with someone you don't know that well, yeah, you're kind of like willing to take that little bit of risk. But there was definitely a feeling of like, hey, like let's again, go to a park first, let's just keep our masks on, go on a walk, and then it becomes a second in-person date, third, and you kind of build that trust, even though like you've only known them for a limited amount of time. Like at least at that point it felt a little bit more comfortable. And then I'd say like probably towards the end of 2020, I think when everybody was like, all right, kind of over this, I think some of the at that point, maybe not for lack of a better term, it's not that I wasn't careful, but it just wasn't as much of a, hey, like have you, gone to big gatherings, or, what are your, are you masking when you go out? It was more of a, like, hey, you seem like, it seems like we're both responsible adults, and, I feel like I've trust that, no, you kind of have to kind of trust that the other person's on the same page.
Yeah, I definitely, not dating wise, but I feel like there is like a new social contract in place that people have had to negotiate or like learn new, which is like how to hang out with people and like respect people's boundaries and comfort around like COVID and all that. And at some point it changed from something that was explicit to implicit, where you just kind of like, okay, like I trust this person is like thinking about, my situation before they meet, even though maybe they're not, but yeah.
I mean, I think, like being in LA, or in California in general, there's just kind of more of an acceptance that people, or an assumption that people are going to be taking the necessary precautions. I know there are some other places where maybe perhaps, I don't know how I would feel, because you don't necessarily can't have that as strong of an assumption whether that other person is taking the same precautions. So I think, towards the end of 2020, it just felt like, all right, like people kind of have their way of doing things. And, we've kind of gotten used to this a bit by the end of 2020, where it's like, okay, well, feels like, not that we're throwing caution to the wind, but you don't have to like interrogate everybody.
So did you find that, you kind of mentioned during the pandemic, doing Zoom dating, you went a little bit outside of like the type of person that you would normally date. Have you found that that's something that you've taken with you out of that into IRL, or are you kind of like gone back to what you're normally interested in?
I think some, again, it gave me an opportunity to meet new kinds of people, and find, very different personalities. And on the opposite side, it made me like realize some of the things that I used to be attracted to. Actually, I'm not as attracted to that anymore. And so, I think, the whole pandemic just allowed me to accelerate some of the changing values that I've had, and an approach to dating, to be more open to new types of people. It's not like I've gone fully to new, type, but I definitely am more willing to see like, okay, like could be a fun date. Let's give it a try.
The real question is, are you dating Asian people now?
Wow.
Yeah, I have. Yeah, putting me on the spot.
Yes.
I have gone on quite a few dates with Asian people. I think I just also have realized that's in California. I think there's a lot more. So I've just never been in a place where there's just this many Asians around. Growing up in Florida and living in Chicago, it wasn't as easy to interact and find people that I'm now realizing, oh, we have like very, very similar backgrounds, and there is something to that. Whereas, in other places, it was kind of not rare, but it wasn't as present for me. So yeah, I mean, I know. I've definitely expanded in that regard as well.
Woo!
Yay.
Yeah, it's funny. So our friend group is like hilariously half Asian, half white. We're like 9, so we're like technically more than half Asian, I guess, because we have like one more Asian person than white person. But we're like heavily Asian represented in or in our friend group. But then I remember during business school, because yeah, you spent a lot of time in Chicago as well. I think we had a few times where you merged your friend groups from like pre-business school. I was like, wow, all of his friends are white.
Yeah, I mean, I know it's just one of those things where when you grow up in a place like Florida, like my upbringing was like that show Fresh Off the Boat. It was just very white suburbia. That's what I was surrounded by. That's what I kind of grew up knowing. And so yeah, I'd say it's been quite the cultural, not shock, but just like it's been cool to see in LA kind of the diversity and just more of my being able to see my culture down Main Street and things like that.
Well, going on a tangent related to that, you said you have like a very loose connection kind of to Eddie Huang, right? From Fresh Off the Boat, or like you had like hung out and something like that.
I have not hung out with Eddie Huang, but
not with him. I just mean like places and like.
I mean, it was Orlando in the '90s. That's where he was. That's what the show's about. So there weren't that many Chinese people in Orlando in the '90s. So in the same kind of Asian associations through Chinese school, we had mutual friends and. I was actually just talking to my parents about this over Thanksgiving. They're like, "Oh yeah, we know who they are. We so and so knows them, and they know them, and oh, we heard their son is doing this now, and the whole typical grapevine thing." Have a loose connection to Eddie Huang.
We're like 3 degrees away from Eddie Huang situation.
Yeah, I'd say two and a half.
When it comes to, I'm gonna like flash back to the dating stuff.
Yeah.
When it comes to the like Zoom dating, did you feel like, because I remember when I would even like just meet up with someone new, there's like a little bit of like nerves, like anxiety, anticipation. Did you find that was like different for a Zoom date versus like an IRL date?
Yeah, I'd say it's the same. There's a little bit, if anything, it's even more just leaning into it, right? Because all of a sudden you're like waiting for the phone to ring, or you're calling them, and then all of a sudden their face is on the screen, and so that's just all of a sudden you're like thrown into it, and so yeah, I'd say the nerves are still there. It's a very interesting thing compared to when you're doing it in real life, where at least you have like the beginning hug and there's a little bit of small talk. And then you're usually about to do something, but in this case it's kind of like, all right, well, this has started, and you just kind of have to dive right in.
This has started.
Yeah.
Did you have a specific way you would present yourself, or you would use a specific Zoom background or something like that?
Oh, Zoom background, yeah.
Ooh. I think to be honest, I think at first it was like very much like, okay, like I gotta make sure my background's all nice, or use a virtual background, and then all this kind of stuff. And then I think eventually, I don't know, I just also feel like people are like, all right, well, this is actually kind of, you don't need to do all that. You can just kind of be more natural. It was definitely like, made me clean my apartment more. That gave me like a bit of a reason to do that. But yeah, no, it was definitely at the beginning, because again, like this is something no one really had done this before. And then I realized, like, as I was going through some of these dates, like I never really paid attention to what was behind them or anything like that. Because it's so much about the conversation, that I realized, oh, okay, like maybe I don't, for me personally, I just need to make sure, like, I'm at least on my couch and just, have a normal conversation. And to your original question, like, I don't know, I didn't really have any like openers. It was just like, hey, how's it going? Like, how's your day been? Again, like to my earlier point, it just, the more, as I did more of them, it just felt like you were FaceTiming someone, like your friend, right? So yeah. Without like the friendship part, but like at least it was like, hey, like, how's your day been? What have you been up to? And then you would kind of go from there.
And has it made your IRL dating game stronger? Because now you're like, I survived Zoom dating, and now I don't care at all how it like, not that you don't care how it goes, but you're like, you know what, I can do this.
Oh, that's a good question. Since I'm still single, I guess you could say. No, it's interesting. I don't know if it's changed anything once it went back to real life dating. Um, I don't know. It just maybe it's more subliminal for me, and I haven't noticed if it's changed anything. But I think just overall, like I don't know, when it started to get back to normal and you would meet up at a bar or anything like that, it was almost like I didn't want to think about the quarantine time and what that whole awkward situation was like.
Blocked that out of your memory.
Yeah, a little bit of
Nice.
that. And
Delete.
also, it's just two very different experiences when you're doing like I wouldn't approach a date at a restaurant or at a bar the same way that I did on FaceTime, right? Because those are two very different settings. Did it make me maybe more, again, when I was meeting new people that I wouldn't have gone on a date with before, it made me more open to just, having those conversations about things that I just didn't really have a lot of familiarity with, or also for me, like if they, didn't really have familiarity with, myself, like opening up a little bit more. I think that helped, because it's interesting on FaceTime. I did find that you got quicker to opening up in some cases with some people, because it's, to your earlier point, that'll not so much like speed dating, but just like because it's all about the conversation,
Yeah.
it got to some deeper things when there was a true connection there. And that was for me when I realized, oh, there's something here, like because we would go into topics that I typically wouldn't be going into on a first date, or necessarily as deeply. But when you're kind of talking on FaceTime, it just felt more natural to do that.
Yeah, I asked that question because I feel like when I talk to a bunch of my friends, they're like, there's a more YOLO attitude towards it, in the sense that they used to think a lot about what the person might judge them on, but now you've gone through the whole thing where it's like, it's kind of this whole like life's too short thing where why are you worried about that? Like if they don't like you as you are as a person, we'll just move on to the next person. So it does sound like there's a little bit of that where you're like more you're more presenting of the things that you normally wouldn't share to people on a first date.
Yeah, no, that part I totally agree with. It just, I think and maybe this is also just, as I'm getting older, it's just some of the superficiality. It feels like you kind of get over that a little bit faster, because as I mentioned, like I kind of enjoyed having those types of conversations when there was that connection, and so now like when there is that opportunity on the first date, like I'm not as like, oh, maybe I shouldn't go down that path in this conversation. I'd be more open to seeing where it goes.
Once you kind of started transitioning to some IRL dating or like hybrid or whatever, did you have any like shocks with readjusting to social life? Because we talked outside of dating, we've talked about like, oh, we're all so awkward now because we've like been isolated and only done virtual things for so long, forgot how to be normal around people. Did you have that at all with the dating?
The first few were like super rough. I mean, you already are thinking like, do I go in for a hug or like, how do I even do that? And then you add in like, well, there's technically a pandemic going on, so is that even like appropriate? I'd say the first few, it just overall was just like getting used to being in a social setting like that. So it's definitely awkward at first. I'd like to think that it's gotten back to normal for me, where it feels like, there isn't that like fear going in that like I've lost all my social skills. At least I'd like to think so. But yeah, it definitely was weird just because also I think, again, it's a two-way street always. So that was the one comforting thing, was just like, yeah, this is weird. There was like a little bit of that acknowledgement at the beginning. It was just like, yeah, I don't know, like, do we fist bump? Okay. And then you'd have a good laugh about it and then go on inside and kind of, have a normal date after that. So it almost broke the tension a little bit faster because like there was also acknowledgement that like, hey, I'm getting used to this again too. So you had a little bit more of that like leeway a little bit to be awkward, even though I'm like already kind of an awkward person naturally.
Not that awkward.
All right, so we're gonna go on to the fortune cookie part of the podcast because we always like to end on a sweet treat. And our prompt for you is to anonymously share with us your worst Zoom date experience.
Oh, that's a good one. Yeah, it was one where sometimes it would just happen like right away. Like I'd be on the app and they'd be like, "Hey, let's just FaceTime now." It's like, "Whoa, okay." Like,
Shit.
sometimes like it's like, "All right." Like sometimes you're like, "No, let's do this another time." And again, this was like height of pandemic, so sometimes I'm just like, you know what? Fuck it, let's try it. Let's go for it. One time the girl was like clearly wasted already, and I didn't realize going into the call that she was so drunk. And so I get on, the FaceTime because she's like, "Hey, let's talk now." I'm like, "Okay," it's been a good back and forth on the app. I get on and she is just completely gone, and I'm just like, "Oh, hey," and she's like slurring her speech, and she can't understand her. And then she like just starts. She's like, "Do you mind if I smoke?" And I'm like, "Sure." And then she just starts ripping like a bong, and I'm just like, okay. At this point for me, I'm just like, I'm just now at this point, I know it's not going to go anywhere. I'm like, this is just entertaining at this point. So we had fun because I was just kind of just having a conversation with her as she's like super drunk and high, and I was like, all right, I guess I'll have a little bit of a drink. But yeah, she was, I don't even know if she would have remembered that we had that conversation, because clearly I never heard from her ever again. But that was definitely one of those where I was just like, that was interesting.
Chaotic.
Oh my God.
It was also one of those situations like, I wanted to be like, this isn't normally the type of person I would go on a date with. That was one of those scenarios like, okay, if I run into that again, maybe vet it.
Oh my God.
And have a little bit more of a conversation.
We have to hunt her down and get her side of the story.
Yeah, and the funny thing is, I think she was like a teacher too. So I was like, whoa.
Oh no, she must have had a really. I think teachers were having a real hard time.
I know. True. So I was like, you know what, this, let's just. I was like, all right, this is what it is, and from what I remember, it was a fun conversation. I just knew that she wasn't like gonna remember most of it.
I just want to know what she thought she was gonna get out of it.
I'm sure she remembers a little bit, because if you never heard from her again, I think she's mortified. Probably.
That's true. Probably. But that's the thing. Like when it was like April, May, June, and we didn't know what was going on, and there was nothing to do. I hate to say it, there would just be times where you're just like, all right, well, I'm bored, so I'll just like go on, and then you'd match with somebody and you just be like, all right, well, I guess I'll just talk to this person. And that's where you get into situations like I did, where the person was Blackout. So that was probably, I wouldn't say the worst, but just like the most like interesting. The worst ones are the ones where it's like clearly like just a lot of dead air, and in the first 5 minutes it's just like, all right, there's not really a connection here, and then at like you're both kind of like, all right, who's gonna be the one that says, oh, I gotta do laundry, gotta go,
right? Gotta answer this text message.
Exactly.
My cat urgently needs me.
Exactly. Everybody's gotta find that out.
What's the shortest Zoom date you've had?
Probably about 15 minutes.
That's still, if you know within 5 and you still let it go for 15, that feels like it's still quite a bit.
I know for me, sometimes when it gets to that point, I'm just like, all right, well, let's just like, start talking about random stuff. And then, at that point, it was like, all right, I think we've exhausted all potential options here. I was like, oh, my stove, I gotta go cook dinner at 4:30 p.m.
Oh,
I love it.
Yeah. I will say there was a point where I was like, oh, I could do this like in normal times. I feel like there was like, this is cool. I was like, this is a nice casual way to like meet someone for the first time, get a sense to know them. Maybe I'll do this from now on. And once things got back to, I was like, yeah, I'm not going to do that.
I feel like it was kind of like forcing millennial, well, and Gen Z, but like millennial and younger people to like face the fact that we never, like, our generation's not phone people, right? Like we like never talk on the phone. You like text mostly,
Yeah.
right? So versus like my brother is technically, he's at the like highest end of millennial, where he's basically more like the previous generation. And he like loves getting on the phone with like new people, and I'm like, how are you on the phone for like 1 hour or whatever with some random human? But
Yeah.
it's like, okay, we don't have that kind of habit, and then also add video into it. Like that's what this was.
Yeah. I will say though, because of it, like now I like FaceTiming with my friends. So that, that's one of the positives came out of this. But yeah, it was a bit of an adjustment to experience it through a screen like that. But for better or worse, it was just kind of like a sign of the times. Like, right, like this was a weird 2020 and something that some of us had to deal with.
Well, we are very grateful that you shared your experiences, including your hilarious Blackout combo.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining.
Awesome. Thanks for having me. Really enjoyed it.
Yeah, of course. Well, listeners, if you have any questions for us or for Michael, or you want to report your own fun Zoom date disaster or not disaster, maybe you had a really good Zoom date, let us know. Write us in at telluswhereyou'refrom@gmail.com.
Or, hey, you heard Michael's still single. If you're in the LA area and looking for a date, we can hook you up with a Zoom one.
Why do you think I did this?
Yeah, son.
I'll just share my Hinge profile.
Oh, we'll leave it in the episode notes.
The show notes.
The Hinge URL.
man.
Yeah, I like that. Oh gosh. Okay. Well, in other news, thanks for listening, and come back next week. We'll have another episode for you then. But until then,
再见,
bitches.